directors at Old Pueblo, the nonprofit organization that is bringing you this presentation. And for tonight's Third Thursday program, Old Pueblo is delighted to welcome our guest presenter, archaeologist Dr. Mary Ownby. Dr. Ownby utilizes petrographic and instrumental analysis, pottery, and other materials to examine interregional contexts, identity dynamics, technological choices, and ceramic ecology. She's conducted research throughout the U.S. Southwest and many other areas of the world. Dr. Ownby has been an associate researcher at the University of Arizona, and from 2010 to this year was the research petrographer at Tucson's Desert Archaeology, Inc. consulting company. She now runs her own archaeological analytical services company, Ownby Analytical, in Albuquerque. She holds a BA in anthropology from the University of Arizona, a Master of Science in Technology and Analysis of Archaeological Materials from University College in London, and a MA in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. And in 2010, she received her PhD in archaeology from the University of Cambridge in the UK with a research focus on scientific analysis. That's a pretty impressive academic background. This evening, Dr. Ownby will discuss collaborative southwestern Salado Polychrome pottery studies that provide insights into how Ancestral Pueblo migrants moved into the central Arizona and utilized pottery to make cultural connections among themselves and other people they interacted with. So please welcome this month's Third Thursday Food for Thought guest speaker, Dr. Mary Ownby.
Thank you, Bill. So I need to start screen sharing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, here we go. Thanks everybody for being patient. Is that full screen for everyone?
Yes.
Yep.
Or yes, I believe it is.
Yep. Okay. So thank you, Old Pueblo. Thank you, Aldart, so much for inviting me to give this talk. I've been really excited about this type of research that I've been doing for the last almost decade, really, getting lots of opportunities to examine what is called Salado Polychrome or Roosevelt Red Ware. I'm going to use Salado Polychrome because it's easier for me to say. So, but I think it's still a useful term as long as we understand where its limits are. As Bill said, I'm a total archaeology science nerd. I've been very fortunate to work on amazing projects with lots of people throughout the Southwest and overseas. And now I've been able to kind of work that through my company, Ownby Analytical LLC, so that way I can provide scientific services more broadly. So I'm very excited today to talk about this research in the Tonto Basin. I'm not sure how many people are aware of the results of this work, but it is really integral to understanding the broader trends, what happens during this later period. So it's great to be given this opportunity to share this information and thank my collaborators for this opportunity. So I'm going to sort of start with briefly discussing how archaeological scientists, work with various types of data to better understand pottery. So as we all know, we get a lot of pottery on sites, and our questions are where is it made? How is it made? Why is it moving? And as you can see from my little cartoon here, we don't get these letter of provenance where somebody is like, oh, it was made here. That doesn't happen. So but those are key questions, and that we need to understand the answers to that so that we can better understand the role of pottery in past societies and how it reflects community activities. And to do that, we really need to understand the raw materials, what the potter selected, how the materials were manipulated, how it was turned into a vessel, and knowing where those raw materials came from can give us a sense of the level of production, movement of vessels, movement of people. So it's an important aspect to really focus on. And so to do that, we have been able to, as I call, steal methods from the scientific world. Archaeology is a great field for borrowing/stealing methods from other fields and finding great novel ways to apply them to understand our materials and research questions better. So I'm going to talk a bit about two of those techniques that we've stolen from the hard scientists that really provide that information on the clay and the materials added to it and where those came from. So then we can understand pottery and, more importantly, the people behind those pots and the meaning for those pots. So So my specialty is petrographic analysis. That involves using a geological microscope like the one shared here to look at a very thin slice of pottery on a slide, as you can see here. Everyone always says how thin, really thin, 30 microns. That's about the width of a human hair. And it needs to be that thin because the light at the bottom of the microscope has to go through the slide and through the pottery. And the way that that light is interacting with the inclusions in the pot, such as minerals and rock fragments, helps me to identify them. And so once I understand what they are, I can look at the geological origin of those inclusions in the pot, in the paste that was prepared for making that vessel. So for example, if I'm seeing a lot of volcanic rocks, I can say, okay, the raw materials for this vessel were acquired in an area where there was volcanic deposits. And then I look at the site that the vessel came from and I say, are there volcanic deposits nearby that match what I'm seeing for the raw materials for this vessel? And if there are, we can go collect those raw materials and say, okay, we can make a really good argument that this pot was made locally for the people who are using it, and then explore other questions about how they were using that pottery and the importance of it. If there aren't any volcanic deposits near the site where it was found, I can suggest that it did not, it wasn't made there. So it must have come to the site from somewhere else. And in certain cases, as you'll see, we can actually really look into where it came from, based again on understanding the geological origin of those raw materials. And the other thing is that although the clay minerals are too small for me to see at this level, I can look at the clays and sort of get a sense, is it an alluvial clay? Is it a clay derived from a shale deposit? So that gives us additional information for the choices the potters were making, what raw materials they had available to them. I also look at alterations made to the paste. Are they adding timber? It could be sand. It could be fragments of other pottery, which are always a little frustrating sometimes at the scale. Plant remains, other things like that. And that gives us a good sense of the choices the potter was making and how he was working with his materials to make a vessel. And the other thing is I can sort of give a general firing temperature estimate. And most pottery is fired within a pretty, typical range of about 750 to about 850 degrees Celsius. But it can be interesting if you have vessels that are highly fired or ones that are more low temperature. So you might have heard, as Bill was saying, about developing these petrofacies within Arizona. So there are two factors that occur with pottery and geology in central and southern Arizona that really make the kind of work I do with this petrographic method a great success. So the first one is that there is a lot of geological variability within southern and central Arizona. So that provides a lot of unique raw materials in small areas and distinctions between raw materials, the clay or any sand or things that they're using to make the pots. The second is that, in fact, a lot of pottery in southern and central Arizona is made using sand timber. So that gives us a great insight into, those raw materials, because whatever parent rocks were the source of the sand can often be very distinctive. So if we analyze the sand in an area, it can often help us understand these unique zones of sand, and that's what we call petrofacies. So Desert Archaeology has conducted a very extensive program of collecting sands in the Tonto Basin, but in many other basins, as people are aware of, in Phoenix and in Tucson. And through this, we've been able to really outline areas, as you can see here on the left, where you have unique sand that has its own characteristics and features, unlike other areas. And we call those petrofacies. And they represent areas where potters could acquire sand to add to clay to make their vessels. And so characterizing them helps us be able to identify where the pots were made. So like for the Tucson Basin, my esteemed colleague, Beth Nixa, who was my predecessor, for the Tonto Basin, she collected 170 sand samples and was really able to characterize that and enable us to have an ability to give a general but restricted area for where pots are made when we compare the sand, timber, and the sherds to sands that we now know. So another method that gets used frequently in the Southwest in particular is to acquire chemical data. And so that can be done through a couple of different instruments, but in the Southwest, it's often with neutron activation analysis. And the goal is to get chemical data on a large collection of sherds And then you can use statistical analyses to look at groups of sherds that are similar chemically. And that would then suggest that they're being made with similar raw materials. And so just to really nerd out for a minute, the way this works, because people sometimes ask me, you do use a nuclear reactor, super fun, amazing thing to look at. I've seen one. And what happens is you're basically turning the atoms in the crushed up pottery. We ground it into a very fine powder and homogenize the pottery, a little fragment of it. And then it's put into the reactor, and the atoms are turned into isotopes. And as they decay back to their normal state, they release a delayed gamma ray. And that's unique to each element, and the amount is representative of the amount of that element within the pottery. So that usually gives us a lovely Excel table full of amazing data on about 32 elements. And then we get to do the fun bit, at least for me and my friend Jeff Ferguson, who does a lot of this type of work. We get to run statistical analyses on all of that amazing data, and that's helping us to identify groups of similar pottery. And from that, I can usually select some samples to look at under the microscope to say, okay, what is the raw materials here, and how is that, making this a group of pottery all with similar raw materials? And then we get a much bigger understanding of sort of the extent of production of pottery and its movement. So using both methods is really complementary. They work really well together. And Jeff and I and other people have done multiple projects this way to get a good insight into pottery and its movement. So the topic we apply these scientific methods to is one that has been discussed a lot more recently, is understanding better what was happening in Arizona and New Mexico in the 13th and 14th centuries. Because it became clear even very early on in archaeology in these areas that there were some northern features, cultural features from groups in the north that were being found in southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. Here's an example of one of a classic one of these is kivas, and especially the square kivas. So this one comes from the site of Davis Ranch in the San Pedro Valley. So it's very far south. So this indicated that there was some movement of northern groups into southern and southwestern New Mexico. And these people were Ancestral Pueblo groups, and they're called the Kayenta. And a lot of research has been going into, why did they migrate? How did they migrate? How did they integrate? How did they stay connected? And it's really a fascinating topic for understanding broader trends. But one of the things is trying to understand why they moved in the first place. It could be climatic conditions, probably warfare, population movement, even just a cultural tradition to moving. But it was clearly a very complex phenomenon. It involved many groups from a variety of areas. They probably moved differently and interacted with local communities differently over an extended period of time. That's kind of our understanding at this point. My colleagues, Jeff Clark and Louis Bork and others, and many others have done a lot of great research on this topic. So this is just my tiny little bit. But for the Tonto Basin, is obviously a key corridor for moving groups from the north into the Phoenix area and other areas in the south. But in the classic period, right before this kind of activity begins, the area has got quite a bit of diversity in its cultural features. So some of the sites exhibit more sort of northern-ish features to their layout and architecture. Some seem to have more connections to groups to the south. So even within the Tonto Basin, before we get this great movement of people, there seems to be some cultural and ethnic diversity going on. And we don't have clear markers of Kayenta groups in this area, in fact. So what it seems like is that it's been suggested by the other great researchers in this area that probably descendants of the original migrants who had been living in settlements to the east may have eventually come into the Tonto Basin. And one way that we're really tracking these groups, one of the key ways that involves my research is their pottery. And so, that's been one clear sign for the movement and presence of groups and descendant communities in southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. So the first pottery that was sort of made by these migrant communities is called Maverick Mountain Series. It began to be produced in the late 1200s, and the designs are very representative of northern Arizona type pottery, especially Segi orangeware. So that's where you could sort of look at this pottery and say, this is really reflective of groups who were making pottery in the north. This is not, local design schemes. And later, it kind of developed into what's called Roosevelt Red Ware or Salado Polychromes. starting in the 1300s. And again, the designs continue, the features and characteristics of the Northern traditions, but they also start to show that some of their own local developments. So some of their own characteristics come into play, and that allows us to sort of divide them into different polychrome series with different dates as that sort of development continues and variants appear. And so we see that sort of evolving of those original, very northern type designs into something that has some kind of local mix to it. These vessels can be bowls and jars, as you can see here. Bowls are quite common and a great platform for the decorative scheme. They can be made with foil and scrape. That's typically what the northern groups use as a method for making pottery. And that's very important to keep in mind, because southern groups like the Hohokam are using paddle and anvil as their method for forming pots. So there is a distinction here with the type of technology used to make pots. That's good to keep in mind. Another distinction is northern groups typically used organic plant-based paints that they had available to them. So when they were painting these black on white vessels or black on white on red, whereas in the southern Arizona for the Hohokam, those are almost all mineral-based paints. So these are just some ways to kind of think about differences in approach and technology when groups are moving, what their traditions were for making pottery. And when this distribution of Salado polychromes was examined more closely, finding that they were found throughout central and southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, what was unique is that these design schemes seem to be fairly uniform across a very large area, suggesting there had to be continued contact and interaction between groups to come up with an agreed upon style for these vessels. And then when the scientific studies began, before even I came along, and then I kind of continued that, it showed that there were surprisingly quite a lot of places were making the pottery. So it wasn't just, one big area making all the pots and then being distributed from that one simple area. Many places were making it. And it indicated that while migrant communities and probably hybrid communities of locals and migrants were making them in many places, and then they were also exchanging them to other such communities. So it highlighted the importance of these vessels for connecting people, developing connections, sort of communicating information, and that it was important to have a similar design style to communicate those things, but they could all be made, within the valley. So that was a really good and important discovery for this pottery. So to add to that picture, it started at Desert Archaeology, the study of these type of pottery vessels in the Tonto Basin. That started with my predecessor, Beth Nixa, who was looking at Salado polychromes for a project with Patrick Lyons and Jeff Clark. And when I started at Desert in 2010, I kind of helped finish up that work. So that gives a good sense of some of the trends in making this pottery and how that might reflect migrants or descendants of migrants moving into the community and how they were interacting with the local communities. I then had the great fortune to then continue this work on a project with my colleague, Catherine Duggan. And that's mostly what I'll be talking about today. And then for that project, also, I wanted to say I did that work at Desert Archaeology. I was very lucky to do that. We wanted to focus on getting some chemical data in addition to the petrographic data. And we wanted to focus on some utility wares. The previous research had pretty heavily focused on the polychromes, obviously, and that was helpful and important. But we were hoping that, as in other areas where such research had been carried out, usually the utility wares will reflect local production and local raw materials. And that can be really helpful to compare to the polychromes if we are suspecting that a particular site has actually been making the pottery, then we can compare to that utility ware. So that was our project plan, and our pottery that we looked at came from the Roosevelt Platform Mound Study. We owe a lot to them for collecting the pottery, from which we selected 140 sherds from 6 sites to submit for neutron activation analysis to get the clinical data. After that, statistical analyses were conducted, and we actually were happy to find 4 fairly robust groups of pottery that was chemically similar. Sometimes it's hard to find nice, good groups in the chemistry, but we were really lucky this time to get such cleanish groups as best you can. And so from that, we were able to then select some sherds to have been sectioned so that I could get a sense of where the pottery was made, and then all the other samples in that group were likely made with the same raw materials. So we focused mostly on the Gila polychromes and the utility ware with 41 samples for Gila. Tonto and Cliff, we had fewer samples for those and only one Maverick Mountain series, which reflects the lack of that pottery within the Tonto Basin. The 63 utility ware sherds included brownware, redware, and some smudged and corrugated vessels. And we also included what are called Belford perforated plates. These plates were from 3 sites, and they have long been thought to be a hallmark of Kayenta pottery production. And they are associated with the production of polychromes, though how specifically they were being used to make polychromes is not clear, but they do seem to be connected to polychrome production. So we like to look at these as possible indicators that if we have a perforated plate from a site and we can look at the temper, that may indicate that site was producing polychromes. And I want to stress here that when I talk about local, as in, okay, this vessel has sand and it's available locally at the site from which the vessel came from, we term local to be within about a 3-kilometer radius of a site. And that's been shown ethnographically as the distance potters would typically travel for sand. And so a lot of ethnographic information has been compiled by many people to look at how far potters will travel from their house to get sand, and 3 kilometers is about the typical distance. So when I say local, I mean within 3 kilometers of the site. So what were the results? Starting with the utility ware. It was really interesting because the petrographic and chemical data for the utility ware showed that while many sites could have utility ware made locally, also utility ware was coming from other places that it was clearly non-local. So there wasn't that typical completely, okay, all the utility ware is local. It was clear quite a bit of it was coming from other places. So for example, at Armor Gulch, which you can see kind of over there in the Petrobasin Sea, that had sand from the Armor petrofacies as well, but there were a few vessels that wouldn't be local that didn't have that sand from like the Roosevelt petrofacies, so that would be just across Tonto Creek. And we saw that pattern as well with Schoolhouse Point, where most of the utility ware from that site is actually coming from the Klein or the Hackberry petrofacies, so that's D and CD up there. Indicating that utility ware was not local to the site. One perforated plate from the site actually had Klein petrofacies sand and the other Ash petrofacies sand. So the 2 perforated plates from Schoolhouse Point were not made there either. And this kind of pattern continued with the lower ruin of Tonto Cliff dwellings, where you had a few vessels that could have been made locally with Pinto petrofacies sand. But then you had quite a lot that were made with other types of sand as well. You have the upper ruin of Tonto Cliff dwellings had a few vessels of Roosevelt petrofacies, which would be local sand in them, that would be near the site. But other samples had like Ash petrofacies sand was a common one. So a real mix here. When we kind of went over to the area where you get Ash petrofacies sand and Klein petrofacies sand, we started to look at the sites of Klein Terrace, and that was actually made with Ash petrofacies sand, which is across the river from the site, but it's still within 3 kilometers. So for whatever reason, it seemed like at Klein Terrace, they wanted to go across the site to get across the creek to get sand. There's a perforated plate from the site that was also made with Klein Terrace, Klein petrofacies sand. Now the neighboring site of Indian Point had utility ware mostly made with Ash petrofacies sand, which is also across the river from that site. And so, and again, we had a perforated plate from the site that was made with Ash petrofacies sand as well. So altogether, our results on the utility ware showed that while there was some local production at the sites, there were clearly some specialized producers for utility ware production, such as in the Ash and the Klein petrofacies, and that those areas were also making perforated plates. So possibly there was some specialized utility production going on, maybe at Klein Terrace or Indian Point. So that kind of helped us understand a bit of what was happening in the utility ware as a comparison to what was going on with the Gila polychrome. So we did have the one Maverick Mountain series vessel made with sand from the Armor petrofacies, and it was from the site of Schoolhouse Point. So there really isn't too much to say. We have just this one early sherd made at the armor petrofaces. But by the time you get helipolychrome, which is one of the most broadly made and distributed of the Salado polychromes, it was clear several sites were making this pottery within the Tonto Basin. So at Armor Gulch, we had a helipolychrome made with armor petrofaces sand, so local-ish. And at Klein Terrace, these type of vessels were made with ash petrofaces sand, hackberry petrofaces sand, and Klein petrofaces sand. Sorry, that kind of keeps going with the petrofaces. So, and those shirts with hackberry and armor petrofaces sand would not have been made locally. So, a similar picture at Indian Point for helipolychrome, where we have that armor petrofaces sand for almost all of them. The helipolychrome from Schoolhouse Point was made in the armor, Klein, and hackberry petrofaces. The lower ruin of Tonto Cliff Dwellings had 3 helipolychromes, again with armor petrofaces sand. The upper ruin of the Tonto Cliff Dwellings had sherds, again with armor petrofaces sand, and one with ash petrofaces sand, but also one with pinto petrofaces sand. This is why it's good to have that chemical data and look at sherds from different groups. And that could indicate a little bit of local production near the cliff dwellings. So, and one such vessel with pinto petrofaces sand was actually found up at Klein Terrace. So overall, when we're looking at the helipolychrome, what we see is a lot of it is being made with armor petrofaces sand. There seems to be a very specialized production of helipolychromes in that area, but there's a bit of production going on in other petrofaces and other sites as well. Not as much, but a little bit going on there too, and the vessels are moving around the basin. So how does that compare to some of the later types? We wanted to follow these trends chronologically, even if we didn't have a huge amount of the Tonto and Cliff polychrome pottery. When we looked at the cliff pottery or the Tonto pottery from Armor Gulch, Indian Point, Klein Terrace, and Schoolhouse Point, armor petrofaces sand just all over the place. So that specialized production using that raw material is definitely continuing, but we still had a few vessels with ash and hackberry petrofaces sand. So those minor production areas are also continuing with Tonto polychrome. And that picture continues on with cliff polychrome, where we have vessels from Indian Point and Klein Terrace and Schoolhouse Point. Almost all are being made with armor petrofaces sand, but there was one that had pinto petrofaces sand, which was great because it indicated that that little production in that petrofaces was continuing on into the cliff polychromes. So we were sort of excited by tracking these trends and seeing that continuation of what we'd seen earlier. But even though we had some sherds that were indeterminate, the Salado Polychrome, we wanted to take a look at them, and they kind of confirm that picture too, where we had sherds from Armor Gulch, Klein Terrace, and Schoolhouse Point, and most of them had armor petrofaces sand, but there were a few with hackberry, pinto, and ash petrofaces sand. So just more evidence for the fact that there was production going on in areas that weren't using the armor petrofaces sand. So thanks for your patience through all the petrofaces. So what does all this mean? So it's complicated. I guess we should have expected it would be complicated. It always is. And so what we really were looking at was trying to understand that complexity for what was going on in the Tonto Basin during the 14th century. And we saw that with those utility wares, there was some specialized production going on with them, which at first glance would seem atypical and surprising. But luckily, my predecessor, Beth Nixa, had done quite a bit of work on sedentary period pottery in the Tonto Basin. And what she had seen is that pattern as well. So she had seen that there were definitely specialist producers for utility ware in the armor, Klein, and ash petrofaces, same ones we're seeing again. And that pottery made in those petrofaces was being exchanged to 9 other sites. And that's really wonderful because what we're seeing is that the pattern in the later classic period and later is really just continuing the pattern that was developed in the sedentary period, where you have limited production of utilitarian pottery by specialists, and it's exchanged throughout the basin. Understanding why that's the case, there's a lot of reasons that could be put forward. But we were just interested in the fact that such an early pattern continued on even when other people were coming into the Tonto Basin. Now, the decorated pottery seems to be building on that model as well. So what we saw was that there was a lot of production using armor petrofaces sand. However, I would like to say that sand was very fine. It was quite unique and it was very consistent. So I suggested that sand is probably not from a place like Armour Gulch, but more likely to be from Tonto Creek itself. And the use of such very fine, large river sand is a pattern that I have actually noticed when I've done polychrome studies in other areas. So when I looked at what was going on the Salt River and in the Phoenix area, and when I looked at what was happening in the upper Gila River area with Salado Polychrome production, the same pattern appeared, where they were using this very fine sand. And why that's distinct is because that's not what we see Hohokam potters typically using. And so I suggested that what was happening is that the descendants of the Kayenta migrants and the Kayenta migrants themselves, perhaps, were selecting really fine sands and these alluvial clays that were more similar to raw materials they were used to using up in the north. And that these type of pottery of such fine sand could be characteristic of potters who were Kayenta descendants. You might even term them Salado potters, for example. However, I would always, of course, say that we can never know how a potter would self-identify. It's just not possible. We can only just sort of say that there is something different here happening with the raw materials that are being selected for some of the Gila polychromes, and that is being used in a specialized production manner. And if we were able to look at those pots and see that they were coil and scrape, that might also give us further evidence that what we're dealing with is people who are coming from the north, making the Gila pottery in the area of the Tonto Basin, but in a different way from the local community, in a way that reflects more of their traditional potting practices. So a great sort of inference about what could possibly be going on based on evidence more broadly for polychrome production. So likewise, we saw Salado Polychrome production being made with coarser sands, especially in the ash petrofacies. And there was a perforated plate at Indian Point that had ash petrofacy sand. And again, those vessels with the polychromes with the ash petrofacy sand look more similar to what would be the local utility wares in this area. So there's a possibility here, because you see that similarity to utility wares and how they're choosing the raw materials, that this could reflect the local communities making polychromes. And if we were able to see if these vessels were paddle and anvil, that would also provide even more evidence that what we may be seeing is the participation of local communities in making polychromes. And so it's sort of tantalizing to say, okay, maybe at Indian Point, what we have is local potters making some polychrome vessels that are moving around the basin. And maybe at Klein Terrace, or possibly a site that's already under Lake Roosevelt, but at least Klein Terrace did have some perforated plates with armor petrofacy sand. So maybe Klein Terrace represents these Salado potters, as I'm sort of calling them, descendants of the Kayenta, who've moved into the Tonto Basin and are making these polychrome vessels for use within the basin to connect groups throughout the basin. So that's kind of our initial understanding of the results. I think that it provides a good view for how these trends are developing within this area. So what does this kind of mean in the broader sense? It's really helping to put Tonto Basin within the context of the broader, complicated but important events that were taking place in the 13th and 14th centuries within Arizona and New Mexico. Obviously, there's a lot of change, a lot of events are happening, but this gives us a picture for the Tonto Basin. Now, this scenario that I'm describing and how people are moving into the area and how pottery is integral to their establishment of communities and relating to each other is probably unique to the Tonto Basin. What we see when we keep looking in these areas with Salado polychromes is localized interactions that are affecting the trends that we see. So this couldn't, what's happening in Tonto Basin is just part of that complex picture and how things happen at a local level relating to larger events. But it was clearly, the migrants or their descendants more likely were coming into the Tonto Basin. They were probably establishing communities relating to each other. And part of that was through Salado polychromes. It was important to make these vessels and important to have them exchanged to other sites to keep communities connected, but also to involve local communities. That seems clear that that was a key part of that was the local involvement. So these vessels had meaning. They had meaning to the groups themselves, the producers, the consumers, bringing groups together. And they may have been used for religious ceremonies, feasting, other spiritual purposes, but they were important. And that's why, there's such a great view for helping us understand community interaction at this time. So I would just, again, clarify that this was a great study for showing the continuation of sedentary period production practices with specialization in utility ware production and the use of specific areas with sand. And it seems like what happens is that when we get that Salado polychrome pottery being made, it's really mapping on well to what the existing patterns were. So if we do have potters coming in, Kayenta descendants coming into the area, they're not disrupting the entire ceramic production system that had been placed already. And you can almost sort of imagine them talking to the local potters and saying, hey, what are good clays? Oh, I see you like to add this sand. Well, we don't know how to work with that kind of coarse material because that's not what we're used to. So we're going to use these over here, but still playing in and mapping in and using some of the same raw materials in a slightly different way, but probably interacting as potters and talking and communicating with local potters as they settled and sort of inhabited this space. And it's important to keep in mind that when people are coming into the places like the Tonto Basin, there were already connections that had been made. We see shell found in northern Arizona and white mountain red ware found within the Tonto Basin. So if you're going to come into this area, it's probably based on already having key connections. So the Kayenta migrants, leaving their homeland probably already had connections with small groups in the Tonto Basin, knew of them, and maybe they settled outside the basin initially because we really don't see that strong Kayenta signature archaeologically within the basin. But then they still maintained those connections with the Tonto Basin, and maybe their descendants came from the east and settled there. So just to keep in mind that, there were existing connections and ties, maybe even in the movement of perishable items throughout Arizona that would have facilitated movements of people into the Tonto Basin. And so while a lot of the research on Salado has really been focused on the ideology and the movement of the migrants, one of the things I take away when I'm engaged in this research is that people were probably very well connected even before they left the northern areas. And that was what really facilitated their ability to settle in these various areas and develop unique and amazing pottery. And I really think it's key that, those contexts were probably very well established that made this migration and resettlement as successful as it was, and a wonderful archaeological phenomena that we can try to, in our own way, better understand and know more about how the past was played out during this complex period in Arizona. So that's my research. That's my little bit of adding to that big complex picture. And I really appreciate you taking the time to give me the opportunity to present this information. I really want to thank and express a lot of gratitude to Patrick Lyons and Jeff Clark and Catherine Duggan, to Desert Archaeology and Archaeology Southwest, and the National Science Foundation for funding. Jeff Clark has always been very helpful in this research, and thank you again, Aldar, for this opportunity. It was really my pleasure to talk about my nerdy scientific research.
Well, thank you, Mary. That was great. There's a lot of information, a lot of really good stuff. I think we all have heard a lot more about Tonto Basin petrofaces than we had before.
Sorry about that.
No, that's great. And I'm certainly totally unaware of Armor Gulch and its prevalence in petrofaces. We got a few questions so far, mostly from Frank, who was putting things in as he thought of them.
Great.
So he said, going back to when you were talking about thin sections, how do you prepare such thin specimens for analysis, and how many prospective samples fall apart?
It's so funny. I talk about this research, and someone always asks how I make the thin section. So you're in luck. because although most petrographers send the pottery to places that make these type of slides, I actually make them myself. I do research in Egypt where you can't export pottery, so I actually make these slides on site. It's a hard task, but essentially what you do is you take a piece of the pottery and you grind one slide down incredibly flat as you can, and you use a special resin. It's an epoxy resin, and you glue it to the slide and you let the resin set. And if you're in a laboratory setting, there's a special instrument that allows you to slowly grind the sherd down to the approximate thickness of the 30 microns. If you're me in the field, you're cussing a lot as you use sandpaper to slowly grind down the sherd by hand. I finally found a light portable grinding wheel to take in the field that I can use now. That's much better because I'm too old to do it by hand anymore. And but once you get it ground down, I have a portable petrographic microscope. That's how I check to know when it's the right thickness. I can see that with the quartz grains. And then I put a cover slip on it, and then it's ready to go. When I send pottery away to the professionals, it all comes back beautiful, amazing thin sections. When I make it myself in the field, there are pots that will refuse to become slides. No matter what you do, you can talk nicely to them, you can threaten them, you can cajole, you can plead, you can beg, and they will not make thin sections. They will not do it. So I've been lucky. It's taken me a long time to perfect my craft in Egypt, and I don't lose too many because I do some hand finishing, and that really, gets me to be able to keep that on it. But yes, you will cry when you've labored over your thin section and that last tiny little bit of thinning and it's gone.
Mary, could you stop your share so we can see your face a little larger?
Do I have to?
Fine.
I think the cat only meowed twice.
So what's like an average time for making a slide?
That's going to depend. So in Egypt, when I'm making Nile clay pottery, obviously a lot of pottery is made with Nile clay. It's right there. Those are fairly cooperative, and they don't get very hard when they're fired. So I can usually make about 10 of those a day. They have to. I let the resin set overnight. So usually what I do is I put 10 on one day, come back, thin them. If I'm lucky, get all 10 thin. They use calcareous clays from the desert, and those fire much harder. So I've spent 2 hours trying to thin one once. So it can depend. But now that I have my grinding wheel, it goes a little quicker. So it just took some time to work that out.
So Frank also asked, what's the basic distinction between Maverick Mountain series and the later Salado Polychromes?
I believe, and I'm an expert on that, it's the decorative designs. So I would have to hunt to somebody who's more familiar with that. But yeah, I think the Maverick Mountain series, the Segi, they have much closer affinity in the design styles and layout to the northern types, the Segi orange wares. Whereas the later polychromes have their own developments and start to get away from that a little bit. But I think I prefer the ceramicists to answer that question so that they get it right.
If I could just comment on that. Some archaeologists, I think Patrick Lyons included, consider Maverick Mountain Polychrome to be a predecessor to the Salado series.
Yeah.
Yeah. Frank also asks, does the prevalence of armor petrofaces in ceramic production suggest some kind of ritual significance for this sand?
It's possible. It really could be. I think for me, I was tying it more to the use of that fine sand, which I think for me, I interpret as probably what I'm calling Salado potters, or the descendants of Kayenta potters, using raw materials that is more workable for them. So the potters who were making pottery up in the northern Arizona region were using shale clays. These are clays that you just kind of get out of shale formations, which are very broadly distributed. It's a harder type of clay that needs a little bit of processing. Pottery made in southern Arizona is almost always made with these coarse alluvial clays, and then they add sand to it. So very different properties. I actually did a small experimental study where I used coil and scrape to make pottery with both types of raw materials, and I did paddle and anvil for both types of raw material as well. See if the way that they were using, the technology for forming, how that related to the raw materials themselves. And it turns out that paddle and anvil, really works great on those coarse secondary clays with sand timber. And coil and scrape works really great on shale clays with some grog timber. So I think for me, when I'm seeing that fine sand, like I see along the Salt River, there's a major production of polychromes using very fine Salt River sand, which was never used by the Hope Common Phoenix. Same along the upper heel. You see the use of actual upper heel of sand from the river. You do not see that prior to the Kayenta people moving into that area. So that's my working hypothesis or inference, is that these polychrome, specialized polychrome, intensive production of polychromes using these fine major river sands, I interpret as indicating that it's Kayenta people making them. And if we had more of the whole vessels that I could analyze, people don't like me to, let me take a big chunk out of your lovely whole vessel. They're not a big fan. But if we could really look at if they were doing coil and scrape for vessels with the fine sand, I think that would bolster my initial understanding.
Well, speaking of that, I'll ask, have you actually identified any Tonto Basin Salado Polychromes that use paddle and anvil versus coil and scrape?
Not to my knowledge, but I'll have to defer to my wonderful ceramic colleagues. So if they have, they can certainly, chime in or something. So, but I think, again, a lot of time what we get are sherds, small sherds. I think Catherine had done some work on that. And I know I've talked to Jeff about that as well. But it would be nice to do a small study of near complete vessels where the forming method has been identified, which can be challenging because, these are beautiful bowls. They've been smooth, they've been painted. But you can do something like zero radiography is good for looking at forming methods of whole vessels. So it's kind of one of these, it'd be a great research project. If somebody has a big bag of money, let me know. I'll see if we can find some whole vessels that somebody would be willing to let me take a tiny chip off, and maybe we could do some methods for understanding, clarifying how they were made.
Yeah, often on the paddle and anvil vessels on jars, if the jars are not smooth on the inside, you can actually see the anvil indentations to know that it's paddle and anvil technique.
So Carmen asks, what evidence is there for the function of perforated plates? Is there residual organic material in the holes? Do modern indigenous peoples have analogous vessels? The holes have been attachments for fibers or sticks.
Those are all great ideas that I've seen in the literature. Patrick Lyons wrote a great article on perforated plates. I believe he did find some that had a bit of clay sticking to the interior. And so I think that's one of the major arguments for why they're connected to pottery production. So that's my memory, but check Patrick Lyons' article on that if you want to get more detail, or if somebody wants to chime in on that. But that's my understanding.
Another question from Ken. Can you characterize the patterns of exchange that you found, e.g. which KN areas exchange what objects or materials or products with the Tonto Basin or other areas? Has social network analysis been used to research these relationships?
I think there has been a little bit of social network analysis done, but that would be mostly on percentages of different types at different sites to see if they have the same percentages. I will defer it's more to the experts on that. But I think they have looked a bit about to see if the kind of patterns they're seeing in the Tonto Basin are similar or different from other patterns. So if one of the Matt Peoples in the audience so wants to weigh in on the social network analysis. So as for other goods, there's a little bit of research that's been done on shell. I wish there was, it'd be nice if we could do a bit more research on the types of things that were moving around in complicated trade networks before the people were leaving the northern Arizona area. I don't know, Al, if you have any to add to that.
Well, his question seems to ask, are you identifying specific Kayenta potters who came down as the initial migration into the Tonto Basin? And I think what you're really looking at is something that occurred after the migration was almost complete. But you have the descendants of Kayenta potters still continuing to make that pottery the way that they had learned in their culture. So I don't know that you would necessarily see evidence of direct exchange from the Kayenta area with the Tonto Basin. It's just exchange within the basin that you're really talking about. Is that not true?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there was some early polychromes that were not made in Tonto Basin, but then once you get into the Pinto and the Gila and the Tonto, those are being made. So in southern Arizona, we did a very large project with Archaeology Southwest with Bruce Bork and Jeff Clark, and the work, and up there Gila was with Deb Huntley. There we are tracking movement of polychromes between valleys. So I see it more there, where I can say to myself, okay, here's a pot that was made in the Safford Valley, or the Safford area, but is actually being found at a site like in the Upper Gila, or stuff moving from like the Sulphur Springs Valley into like the San Pedro Valley. So in southern Arizona, we do track cross valley movement of vessels of polychromes. And we even have a site that was really making and consuming almost all its own polychromes, but was distributing and getting a small amount. So we do see various patterns and levels. The Maverick Mountain series usually stays within the valley. The Gila polychromes will cross valleys. We know production is taking place in Tucson. We know production is taking place in Phoenix. As far as moving out of those valleys, we see evidence for that a lot less for the Tucson and Phoenix basin. They're mostly being moved within, although in Phoenix, it looks like they're moving quite far to the periphery of the Phoenix basin for exchange. I think those patterns are going to be, it seems like very dependent on the valleys.
Okay, great. Cynthia asks, what about identifying clay sources in the basin?
Yeah, that's a good question, because obviously what we're doing is entirely based on sand. The clays haven't been characterized the way the sand has. The sand is just a little more straightforward than the clays have. So clays haven't been collected in the Tonto Basin, and it's now frustrated by Lake Roosevelt. But certainly that could be something that could be done. I think at this point, we feel like the sand is giving us the view that we're looking for, along with the chemistry. So, but I have other research projects where collecting clay is been very critical to understanding where pottery is made. It's just we're fortunate here in Arizona with the geological diversity that produces unique sands and the use of sand as a tempering material.
Well, speaking of clays, Carmen's got some questions and thoughts. Is there petrographic evidence for the alignment of clay particles? Scraping should give a different angular alignment than paddling, compressing, as well as different surface texture.
So that has been done. What you do when we do our work in the petrofacies area, we take a thin section that's parallel to the vessel wall, and then you're not going to see those alignments as clearly. When we're not doing that, we take cross sections, and then you could see those alignments. They're hard to see because that cross section is really tiny, and you're just getting that really tiny view of the pottery. I've seen alignment of clay better in Egypt where they're using a wheel. And they're even in a small cross section, you can kind of see those particles aligning. But I think using zero radiography or even CT scans, other things like that, I think are much better for seeing those patterns than what I can see, because my view is just so small.
Great. Somebody named Lucius, I guess is Bill, It says, I believe that Amsden suggested that Cayena perforated plates were used in the construction of string bags, but never found the time to replicate string bag production techniques.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. Or Lucius.
Lucius, yeah. What is the approximate area of the armor petrofacies? How much of the area, and where within it is that fine sand that you discussed?
So I think the fine sand's going to be closer to Tonto Creek, if not in Tonto Creek, for that fine sand. So it's still, the characteristics of it is still of the armor petrofacies. It's got dye base. It's lucky, we're lucky it's got a very clear dye base in it. So it would be, you know, close to Tonto Creek or in Tonto Creek. And that runs a fair distance. I'd have to check the map. Let me bring it up. I'll try not to screen share, but I can check the map and see if it's clear. I guess if I wanted to make sort of it'd be about, I think that'd be about 20 kilometers along Tonto Creek and along that edge of the armor petrofacies. So like a 20-kilometer area within that. And again, the sand is pretty consistent. So for me, it's going to be limited. It's a specialized production using the fine armor petrofacies sand. So that's not going to be, you know, multiple places along those 20 kilometers. It's likely within a more restricted area within that, from my perspective.
And Joyce asks, why do you think the HOCOM didn't prefer finer sands?
Because I think it works. In my experience, again, those coarse alluvial, secondary alluvial clays with coarse sands are awesome with paddle and anvil. If you're beating something, having that kind of coarseness helps kind of buffer against that pressure. And so it really helps to, I mean, they're not beating it hard. They've got the anvil on the inside and then they're tapping it as they bring it up. But that paste recipe is ideal for that forming method. It's going to be a chicken and egg argument. You know, did they find a forming method that worked well with their clay and raw materials? I think so. But I guess if you wanted, you could argue that they were looking for raw materials that would work well with paddle and anvil. But it is important to note that in areas that are using paddle and anvil technology, the common clay resources are secondary clays. Whereas the area where we see them using coil and scrape, the common resources are what we would call primary clays. So these are shale lenses that create clay. And so the pattern I've seen in my hideous little experimental pots, which I fired and then promptly destroyed and put them out of their misery, that sort of has been my experience with the selection of raw material matching well with the technology used to make the pots.
Very interesting. Like that. So I'm not seeing any more questions or comments. Al, do you have any?
One of my own. I was kind of intrigued that you found that a lot of the utility vessels were being made at specific sites and distributed outward from there in the Tonto Basin. Have you seen similar patterns in the Phoenix or Tucson areas where you've worked?
Yes, definitely the Phoenix. We know the plane bearers were heavily made in the South Mountain area. So when I saw that pattern that was picked up by Beth first in the sedentary period and then was continuing later into the classic period, that was my first thought. I was like, oh, you know, that's kind of like what's happening in the Phoenix Basin, where you have an intensive production of utility ware pottery in the South Mountain area. And then a lot of the buff wares are being made along the Middle Gila River. Tucson has that as well, where you do have a few sites that seem to be making a lot of that utility pottery and moving it around. I don't think it's quite to the degree that you see in Phoenix. So.
Yeah, the reason I was surprised is because I've kind of always assumed, apparently incorrectly, that most people made their own utility pottery where they live, but they, you know, often obtained the decorated pottery from someone else.
And the funny thing,
you're not finding that to be the case.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting is that is a pattern when we were looking at the material from Southern Arizona. So I mentioned that big research project with Archaeology Southwest and Lewis Ford. I said, can chemistry and petrography on utility wares. And I went out and collected sand near the sites for that study. And the utility wares were made with sand near the site. And that pattern was there, which is like every time I'd see a utility ware from a site, it would be made locally with the sand. And then you could see sometimes the polychromes were also made with similar raw materials, and sometimes they weren't. So it is interesting that there are areas where that does hold, but the Phoenix Basin and the Tonto Basin don't show that to that extent. And it may just be the cultural trend, freeing people up for other tasks. In the Phoenix Basin, they have a very clear idea of the type of raw material that they like to use. So that even if they have access to things that are like volcanic sands, they won't use them. Usually they'll use something that's like a granite with a mica in it, or schist. There's exceptions to that. There's like fine quartzites and stuff like that, but they seem very picky about their raw materials. I mean, there's tons of sand and the clays are, you know, secondary and things like that. But yeah, they know what they like.
Very interesting.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up now. So on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, I'd like to thank you, Mary, for sharing with us this evening. It was really good. Enjoyed it a lot. I also thank all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. And if you would, please consider making a donation to help pay for Old Pueblo's Zoom subscription and program expenses and supporting Old Pueblo's education programs. See how. And thank you and good night.
Great. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everybody.